So hey guys, welcome to Appalachia's Homestead. Tonight we are at David Crockett Birthplace State Park, and we are going to be telling you about the story of the Overmountain men and the journey to Kings Mountain. Hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching.
My name is Henry Reynolds. I was born in Sussex County, Pennsylvania, and when I was 5, my father packed us up and settled us down in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. It's where I was raised and became a man. It's where I learned to hunt and take care of myself. But that game that I so relied upon started to dry up. Now, I had heard tales of a few brave men that had crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains over into Cherokee land. Men like William Bean, James Robertson. They returned with hells of game so plentiful you could hunt all day. Ground so fertile you could drop a grain of corn and watch it sprout. Now, I'd also heard that folks had gone over the mountains against the rule of King George III, started settling, leasing land, making treaties with the Cherokee. These stories, they really intrigued me. So at the age of 21, I decided I was going to be like those brave men and cross over the mountains. So I did. Grabbed my gear, packed my horse, crossed those Blue Ridge Mountains, and rode down into the Watauga Valley. And just like in those stories, folks had settled. I got me a fine piece of land and got to work, clearing it, building a cabin, laying a crop. For the first time in my life, I was free. I was no longer under the thumb of King George. I was on the edge of the frontier, and I was completely free. Like all men that cross those mountains, I joined the militia. I served under Colonel John Sevier. We all called him Noah Chucky Jack. He used us to raise barns, build roads, and to defend the settlements from hostile Indian raids. Those Cherokee gave us an awful lot of trouble in 1776. But that same year, we heard of a man named George Washington who decided to take a stand against the British up north. But this war that we had heard so much about seemed like a lifetime away. We were on the edge of the frontier and never thought it'd ever even affect us. We were wrong. By 1780, the war up north had been drug out for almost 5 years, and King George was getting awfully tired of it. He wanted this revolution to end. So the overall commander of the British forces, Sir Henry Clinton, came up with a plan he called the Southern Strategy. He'd load up his army on ships, sail down the east coast, lay siege to Savannah, Charleston, all the major ports of the South. He was going to raise a loyalist army, train them in the British coat of arms, march this army over the Carolinas, and catch George Washington between these two armies, putting an end to this revolution once and for all. His plan was working rather well. Satisfied that his plan was working, Sir Henry Clinton sailed back up north to New York, and he left Lord Major Charles Cornwallis in charge of all the southern British forces. Now, Cornwallis had 2 men under his command, a man named Bannister Tarleton and another man, Major Patrick Ferguson. Now, Ferguson was in charge of protecting the western flank, raising a loyalist army. Americans just like us, they were still loyal to the crown. He was training them and raising quite an army. In the meantime, some of our patriot leaders on this side of the Blue Ridge had decided to take the fight to the British. Men like Charles, Joseph McDowell, Elijah Clark, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. The British Army would set up camp, and then a pack of frontiersmen would melt out of the woods, lay into them, inflict casualties, and then vanish into the mountains, and they couldn't catch them. This became quite an aggravation for Ferguson. He had his army camped at a little place called Musgrove Mills when a band of screaming frontiersmen came out of the woods, laid into them, inflicted heavy casualties, and disappeared once more into the mountains. Ferguson had had enough. He captured a man named Samuel Phillips and sent him over a mountain with a message for all of us Overmountain men. He told us to lay down our arms, pledge loyalty to King George, or he would march his army over the mountain and lay waste our homes and crops with fire and sword, and hang our leaders. He made a mistake. As soon as Colonel Isaac Shelby heard news of this threat, he sent word to his good friend Noah Chucky Jack, and they began to call the militias. And we didn't know it at the time, but they had also sent word to William Campbell up in Southwest Virginia about helping us all out. All I know, I was having supper with my wife when my good friend Thomas Morgan came riding up, told me to grab my rifle, get my horse. They're calling the militias. I said, why? Cherokee ain't bothered us in an awful long time. He said, no, it's the British. He told me this threat and I was ready to fly off the handle. I packed my horse, grabbed my rifle, bag, and horn, and kissed my wife goodbye. As we rode up the Nolichucky River toward Colonel Severe's place, there were men pouring out of every holler. We were swarming like locusts. Every man was hungry for a fight. By the time we reached the Colonel's place, there were 240 of us. We cut up Cherokee Creek, headed towards Fort Watauga, because that's where it was agreed we'd all meet. We come riding into the fort, and there was Colonel Isaac Shelby. There were 240 men from the Holston. A little while later, William Campbell came riding in with 200 Virginians. And a few hours later, his cousin Arthur came riding in with 200 more Virginians. Our army was growing. As we camped on the banks of the river that night, there were campfires as far as your eye could see. We had no idea what we were going to do. As we camped, all the leaders met in the fort, and they made a decision. They said, Ferguson, he wants a fight. Well, let's give him one. But we won't fight him over here in our fields around our families. No, we'll take it to him. So we did. Next morning, as we were preparing to leave, Miss Mary Patton stopped by for a visit. Now, Miss Mary Patton made some of the finest gunpowder you could hope to get your hands on, and that morning, she brought us 500 pounds of her quickest burning powder. We prepared to mount our horses to leave, and there was a minister at the fort, a man named Samuel Doak. He stepped up, delivered a sermon, told us to go and fight with the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And that became one of our battle cries. And as we rode out from the fort, we were driving some cattle for provisions. It began to rain. We rode until we reached the bottom of the mountain, a spot the old folks call the resting place. We all called it the Shelvin Rock. It's a huge rock overhang, and that's where we decided to store our powder to keep it dry and out of the rain. We all laid out in the nearby field. We got up the next morning and quickly realized there was no way for us to drive this cattle over the mountain. So we slaughtered what we could carry and sent the rest back. We took to the saddle and headed straight up the mountain where the trails crossed over, a little place called the Yellow Mountain Gap. By the time we reached the top of Yellow Mountain, all of that rain had stopped because it had turned to snow. We camped there that night on top of Yellow Mountain, and that was one of the most miserable nights of my life. The wind was whipping and howling, the snow was blowing. I got up the next morning and I remember looking out across the Watauga Valley. Started thinking about my wife and if I'd ever get to see her again. We all knew we were facing the most powerful army in the world, and we all knew our chances were slim. We did a little drilling that morning, took a roll call. Come to find out, two of Colonel Severe's men were missing, Chambers and Crawford. And we figured that they were loyalists who had deserted to ride ahead to tell Ferguson this Overmountain army was on its way. Because that's exactly what they did. We had another problem. On the other side of Yellow Mountain, there were two trails that crossed off and went off into the Piedmont. We knew if we took one trail, Ferguson could be riding up the other. He'd march straight into the fort, and there was nothing we could do to stop him. So our commanders made a decision, something rarely done, and they split our forces. Campbell took his men, took one trail. Shelby and Severe, they took the rest of us, and we took the other. We come off of that mountain with no sign of Ferguson. We come riding to a little place called Quaker Meadows, a plantation owned by one of our Patriot leaders, Mr. Charles McDowell. And we came riding in the pouring rain.
My name is Thomas Morgan. I had served under Colonel John Severe for many, many years. And I had rode with that man on many campaigns against the Cherokee. But I got to tell you, this was unlike anything any of us ever experienced. Because like Henry said, we was riding against the most powerful army in the whole world. An army that had never been defeated. We come riding into Quaker Meadows in the rain, and the McDowells, they were so gracious to us. They let us take the top rails off a fence, burn it, trying to dry out in the rain. Brought in some corn, trying to feed us the best they could. And I remember sitting there in the pouring rain that afternoon, thinking, you know, I'm in a part of the land that I'm not really familiar with. You know, we really had no idea what was in front of us other than a massive army. And as we sat there in the pouring rain that afternoon, here come a whole group of men riding in from Surrey County, North Carolina. They was being led by a Major Winston and a great big man named Colonel Benjamin Cleveland. Now, I didn't know Ben Cleveland personally, but I'd heard of that man. He was notorious for hanging loyalists. If you was loyal to King George and you run into that man, the last sound you'd hear would be your neck snap at the end of a rope, because he'd hang you. I really liked him. Our army was growing. And as we sat there wrapped up in our blankets in the rain that night, some scouts came in. They had located Ferguson. He was a few days' ride from us, camped at a place called Gilberttown. And we got up the next morning, still raining, and all of our commanders had met under a big oak tree. You see, what you got to understand is, we were all militia. And every militia had its own colonel. Well, we had more colonels than ear corn. But the only colonel we had that wasn't from Carolina was Colonel William Campbell from Virginia. So they had voted him our overall commander. We took to the saddle that morning, went thundering across the Catawba River. We was headed straight for him like a lightning bolt. We'll put an end to this threat. We got right outside of Gilberttown, about a day's ride, and the sky opened up on us. It began to pour down the rain. So we squatted under a group of cedar trees, trying to keep our powder dry, trying to stay dry, praying that the rain would stop, but it never let up. So we pushed on. We got right outside of Gilberttown. We tied our horses up into the tree lines, took our rifles and moved in on foot. We went screaming out in that field where old Ferguson was at, and he was gone. There was nothing there but cold campfires. He'd been gone 2 days. And it had rained so much that even the best of us scouts could not find his trail. The ground was like a swamp. One of our commanders, a man by the name of Williams, said, well, he's headed south. He's riding to that big British fort down South line of Fort 96. So we turned and we started riding in that direction because we had to catch him. Now the next night we was camped on the Green River. In the middle of the night, I never heard such a commotion. Man come riding into our camps, the boys grabbed him, drug him out of the saddle. They's gonna hang him. Thought he was a scout or a spy. He said, my name's Colonel Edward Lacey. Take me up to see Colonel Sevier. So we drug him up. Sure enough, Sevier knew him. Lacey asked him, said, where you going? He said, we're riding toward Fort 96. We got to catch Patrick Ferguson. He said, well, I don't know where you got your information, but you're riding the wrong way. Ferguson's not headed to Fort 96. He's headed toward Charlottetown, toward Cornwallis to get reinforcements. And now we all got scared. Because every one of us knew good and well, if he got reinforcements, none of us would ever cross these mountains again. We had rode straight to our deaths. Now Lacey, he had a group of Patriot fighters camped just a few miles from us. And he agreed to meet us the next morning, a place in South Carolina called the Cow Pen. Now, we got up that morning, still pouring the rain, and we rode 29 miles that day. We come riding into the cow pens. Now, the cow pens was owned by a wealthy loyalist. He'd buy up all the cattle in that area and graze them on that good grass, and then pay men to drive them north to Philadelphia and sell them. We come riding in there and we hadn't had a bite to eat since we left Charles McDowell's place. And I can honestly say that every man in the settlement that I knew, none of us were a thief. But I also remember hearing a good Reverend Doak say one time, the Lord helps those that help herself. So that's what we did. We helped ourselves to that man's beef. We didn't think he'd care too much because every one of us was absolutely starved to death, and every one of us had a rifle. And that was the best meal we'd had in days. And as we sat there that evening in the pouring rain, once again the commanders got together and they made a decision. They come walking through our camps that afternoon and they started picking out 900 of the best men. And they picked out 900 of the best horses that we hadn't rode into the ground chasing Ferguson. And I'll never forget it. At 9 o'clock at night, we took to the saddle and we rode off in the dark in the pouring rain, looking for Ferguson. All night long we pushed through that darkness. You couldn't hardly see the horse in front of you, but we wouldn't let up. We crossed the Broad River in the middle of the night. It's completely flooded. Put our strongest horses downstream in case anybody washed out of the saddle. There was nothing going to stop us. Now the next morning, we rode up on a little settlement, little homestead. We had a young man traveling with us. He was quite a little character. Enoch was his name, Enoch Gilman. Now we had used Enoch a few times as a spy. We'd sent him across the river, but he'd sing us a song from the other side if it was clear for us to cross. So little Enoch rode up to the commanders. He said, I got an idea. Let me ride over to that settlement. I'll find out where old Ferguson's at. So we all laid back in the woods. Little Enoch rode across the fields to the house, tied his horse up, walked up and knocked on the door, and there were two women living there. One of them opened the door. Little Enoch looked as mean as he could. He said, I'm looking for Patrick Ferguson. I want to join his army. That lady said, well, I know exactly where he's at because we took him chicken. He's on Kings Mountain. Now, some of the boys give Enoch just about enough time. They figured he found out what we needed. They busted in that house and grabbed little old Enoch, going to hang him as a traitor. And then women commenced to squall, well, don't hang him, he's just a boy. So one of the men spoke up and said, well, not to offend these lovely ladies, let's take him down the road and hang him. So they drug him out of the house where the women couldn't see him. The commanders called him up. They said, Enoch, did you find Ferguson? He said, yeah. He's on Kings Mountain. So now we knew exactly where he was at. And we was riding harder than we'd ever ridden because this threat was going to end, and it was going to end today. About lunchtime, a lot of the men were starting to get tired and they wanted to stop and rest. And old Isaac Shelby come riding right through our lines. He said, rest? I will not rest until I ride through the lines of Cornwallis himself. He fired us up and we kept riding. Now, right before 3 o'clock, by the grace of God, the rain had stopped. And we were at the bottom of Kings Mountain. William Campbell and those boys from Virginia, they took the front of that little mountain. Colonel Shelby and the boys from the Holston settlement, they went around this side. Cleveland, Lacey, other commanders took their militia, took the back of the mountain. Colonel Sevier took all us boys from the Watauga and Nolichucky, and we went around this side of the mountain. We had him. He wasn't going anywhere. We hit that mountain the first time, laid into them, and they drove us back. We hit the mountain the second time. We went a little further, but once again they pushed us back. But the third time we hit that little mountain, we went almost to the top. You know, a lot of us older men remember when we come over to Blue Ridge and settled, when the Cherokees would attack our settlements, well, they'd come screaming out of the woods. It'd make your hair stand up. It'd make your skin crawl. So as we hit that mountain the third time, we were screaming our heads off like the Cherokee. As a matter of fact, the British started calling us the Yelling Boys. But not only were we screaming like the Cherokee, we were fighting like the Cherokee. We was so close to them, some of our boys was fighting with their knives and tomahawks against their bayonets. We was hiding behind the trees and rocks. We'd step out and fire and step back in and reload. And like I said, we went almost to the top. And there was Ferguson. He was on a big white horse. Had his saber in one hand, 2 silver whistles. Well, he was riding back and forth on the crest of that little mountain, blowing those whistles and barking out commands to his men. You know, a lot of his men seen that we was overrunning them. They'd raise up a white flag and Ferguson come riding by and just cut it down. Now, to this day, I can't tell you if he's trying to escape. I can't tell you if he's trying to rally his men. But what I can tell you for a fact is he got too far on the south side of that mountain that day. And he ran smack into John Sevier and us boys from the Watauga. I was standing behind a big white oak tree. Every time I stick my head around to shoot, the bark would fly off. You could hear all the lead rifle balls whistling past you. The air was completely full of gun smoke. It looked like a fog. We couldn't even see who we was shooting at, but we wouldn't let up shooting. There was a young man right over from me that day. John Gilliland was his name. Little old John had been wounded 3 times. He was still at the top of the mountain. I heard him say, "Hey, here comes Ferguson." He raised that rifle. He took a real careful aim. And when he pulled the trigger, it went click. It misfired. But there was an older gentleman right over from him that day. Everybody in the settlement knew this man. Robert Young was his name. Robert was 62 years old. Now, for you folks that don't know, Robert named his rifle after his wife, Mary. But he didn't call his rifle Mary, he called it Sweet Lips, because that's what he called Mary. I seen Robert. He raised that rifle. He took a careful aim. And I heard him say, "We'll see what Sweet Lips can do." Now, when he touched that trigger, let's go. Ferguson came right out of the saddle. But his foot was hung in the stirrup and his horse spooked. You know, by the time the boys got his horse stopped, he had 8 more holes through him. Ferguson told his men when he got to Kings Mountain, he said, "God Almighty and his angels won't take me off this mountain." He didn't know how right he was, because that's where we left him. Every man that was fighting with Ferguson that day was killed or captured. And they were 28 patriots that never seen the sun set that morning, or that evening. We camped there that night, and I got to tell you, to this day, I can hear the sounds of the wounded and the dying. Next morning, we started marching the prisoners north toward the Yadkin River. And a few days later, we sent some boys marching them on, and the rest of us cut, and we headed back over the mountain. You know, it took about a week for Cornwallis to find out we whipped old Ferguson so bad. But when he found out that we whipped him, well, he turned tail and he ran like a scalded dog. As a matter of fact, the last we heard of Cornwallis, old Nathaniel Green and Dan Morgan was running him ragged all over the mountains, and he was headed back toward the coast. But us Overmountain, man, we came back over the mountain. We came over here to raise our crops and to raise our families. But the most important seed that we ever planted was that day on that little mountain. Because within an hour and 5 minutes, we planted a seed of freedom. Because if you think about it, what we did that day, it was nothing short of a miracle. Because there was a band of 900 starved, exhausted, hunters and farmers, volunteered to the very last man. We stopped and we forced the retreat of the most powerful army in the world. And then we came home. Now, this story that we just shared with you, we share with a lot of people. This coming year, Lord willing, and if I stay healthy, it'll be my 18th march to Kings Mountain. Every year since 1975, they've been a group of reenactors followed the trail that the Overmountain men took to Kings Mountain. In 1980, Senator James Broyhill took it to Congress. President Jimmy Carter signed it into law, and it became a national historic trail like the Lewis and Clark Trail, Santa Fe Trail. And every year since 1975, they've been a group of us done this trail. Now, years ago, we used to walk it. Every bit of the trail that was walkable, we was on it. And then we got old and fat. One evening we was sitting at Sycamore Shoals, and I said, you know, maybe we should quit walking so much and start talking more. So we started telling this story. The first year that we started this storytelling, this programming, that I was involved in it, and put it that way, it was 2006. We told this story to 3,400 fourth graders during the march. The year before they flipped out and shut the world down with COVID, we told this story to 17,000 school kids in 3 weeks. Our motto is keeping the story alive. This is the most untold story of the whole American Revolution, because it wasn't the Continental Army that defeated Ferguson. It was a group of frontiersmen. So we keep the story alive. Every year, you'll see a group of us. You can find us on Facebook, like Melanie said, or on our website. We'll have our schedule posted on there, and come September, we'll be coming down the trail, programming for kids or anybody that listens. You may see a group of us standing in a Walmart parking lot doing this whole program. You never know. But September the 25th, if you go to Elizabeth and Sycamore Shoals up at Fort Watauga and walk down to the river at 2 o'clock, same time the Virginians cross the river, you'll see a group of us come out, and we'll cross that river on the way to Kings Mountain. So I would like to invite you all to come out and hang out with us. You don't have to dress pretty like we do. You don't even have to wade the river. You're welcome to come out for the day, for the weekend, for the entire march. When they first started doing this, like I said, when they used to walk, they go through the communities, and everybody couldn't figure out why these strange dressed people carrying long rifles was coming out of the woods. So they started coming out and meeting them, hanging out with them. Then they started bringing fried chicken, potato salad, and it became an annual event every year. So each year, as we pass through the communities, we set up our programs, and they bring the school kids out, the communities come out, and Lord willing, we'll do it again this year. This would be the year for you guys to come out and join us, because this will be the 50th march for the Overmountain Victory Trail to Kings Mountain. So this is the year. But if anybody has any questions, comments, especially if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. If we don't know the answer, we'll make up something. But I hope you guys enjoyed the story, and feel free to join us. Thank you.